Welcome to the Savage Worlds GM podcast. I'm your host, Jared Savage Daddy Gunning. Tonight's episode brought to you by Roll20.net, the world's largest virtual tabletop. Check them out today at Roll20.net. We're on social media. Follow us on Twitter and Facebook at SWGM Podcast. Throw us a buck on Patreon, www.patreon.com/SWGM Podcast. We're also on YouTube. Hold on a second, guys. Sorry. I forgot to mute the live feed. Record backward. Left it off at. Follow us on YouTube. Like, subscribe, share, spread the word. YouTube.com/Savage Worlds GM Podcast. And subscribe on iTunes with the same moniker, Savage Worlds GM Podcast. Tonight, a couple of announcements at the top of the show. Patreon shout outs. We have a few new Patreons. Arthur Fernandez, Greg Grady, and Mel Primus. Welcome. You have our eternal gratitude. Thank you for your pledge and patronage.
You're not worthy. Wait a minute. What am I saying? You're not worthy. You're not worthy.
Wait, did you say eternal or internal gratitude?
Yeah, exactly. And tonight, announcing the result of the Patreon poll to rename the intern now that he's a full-time regular. Welcome, Dustin, the Zealot, the Savage Zealot Smith.
Good evening.
Dave, the Rules Maven Scott. Salute, everybody. Tonight's topic, don't wound your role play. We want to talk about there are other alternatives and mechanics that don't break flow of your narrative story just because somebody mentions or says I attack or I use a gun. It doesn't mean you have to stop what you're doing, break the narrative, and start dealing out cards for initiative turn order. Now, that's the right choice. But we want to talk about ways to do that don't break the flow of your narrative, and when the outcome of the combat really is not as important as the actual gravitas of a scene.
Well, I think there's also something to be said of you hear this constant kind of, what do I do about murder hobo syndrome? Well, stop queuing up combats. Give them another mechanic other than a combat that resolves the scene and move back onto your narrative, and don't break up that flow so that you're not taking wounds to the role play by your players going, and I kill the orc, and I kill the goblin, and I kill the space orc, and I kill the space dark elf, or whatever.
Yeah, absolutely. One quick thing I left out of the intro. If you're watching the live stream, feel free to participate in the chat. We do look at those questions during the show. So, yeah, we're talking about basically combat resolution without combat mechanics. It is basically tonight's topic for the show. So, this comes a little bit of the impetus of this is a recent Dead End session wherein narratively 15-20 zombies are threatening to break through a fence on a farm, and the players all grab AK-47s. Combats, the fact that they're probably going to mow through all the zombies is a foregone conclusion. I do not need to roll shooting rolls and then roll damage against the zombies. That's not what that point in the story is about. It's a tense narrative moment of them dealing with and how they react to, oh, I've had enough of these damn zombies. I've had it.
And the interesting aspect was that as a player sitting there, it wasn't even introduced as here's a dramatic task to kill the zombies. It was here's a dramatic task to determine if you kill the zombies before they break the fence. Therefore, there's never going to be a combat in that scene. Instead, failure of the dramatic task means we shoot the last zombie, but only after they've broken through the fence and are on the property. So the worst case scenario still keeps the game moving forward without a combat, but it adds that drama to the moment and can also have a big impact on the narrative of your game in that, that could lead to an entire side quest where they have to go out and get the materials to repair said broken fence.
Right. And we decided to run it as a dramatic task. A 5-round dramatic task. And I think we even had a complication arise where we made a shooting roll, and somebody scored a 1 on the shooting roll die, and somebody actually took damage from it. And it was there was a little bit of a bump in, okay, well, how do I explain this? Oh, well, he overcompensated on the trigger. It jumped in his hand, and he reaved over to the right, tried to overcorrect, and, grazed the guy next to him, standing next to him.
And that was as much just a dramatic task failure as it was a failure of that mechanic in that moment, because it was just, there were cards being dealt out and the dramatic task was going along without a lot of narrative. So it made it a lot harder to accept that. But at the same time, once we took that step back and went, oh, well, here's the narrative around that, it immediately smoothed it over and we were able to move on. I think, though, the 800-pound gorilla in the room that I want to get out of the way before we dive further into this is neither Jared or I are fans of the quick combat rules that were released in errata and exist out there for combats. But even if we were, that's not what we're talking about. The quick combat rules are more a form of doing the attrition gameplay at your table, to put wounds on your player characters, to take away resources from your player characters like power points or equipment. That's what those quick combat rules are there for. It's there for a specific play style. Because we don't use that play style, we end up not using those rules. What we're talking about tonight is stuff that combat isn't necessary because narratively you need a better response to it. You need a mechanic that doesn't punish the players. We're not talking about something where your players are going to walk away with wounds and lowered power points. We're talking about something where the combat aspect of the scene is so secondary, so transcendental, that it's background to what's going on. And I think in the green room we had a great conversation about the scenes from Walking Dead season 2, where they're standing at the prison between 2 rows of chain link fence with 10 zombies pressed against the outer fence, and they're taking tie rods and sticking them through and poking them in the head and backing off. And that entire scene is not about stabbing zombies in the head. That scene's about the conversation happening between the characters that are standing there doing this. Neither of those characters is ever in danger of those zombies. Worst case, a dramatic failure on a critical fail roll, the tie rod gets stuck and they can't get it back out, and the zombie falls over and pulls it out of the fence, so you're down a weapon, but you're never in danger. So that you don't need to run a combat.
Right. And we kind of touched on this a little bit as an alternative combat mechanic when we talked about doing a Star Wars lightsaber duel as a social conflict, because the point of that duel is not about combat. It's not about chopping your opponent into bits. It's about the back and forth that happens between the two participants in that duel. It's about Vader trying to turn Luke. He's not trying to kill him. He's trying to turn him. It's about Luke resisting. It's about Luke showing his expertise, how he's come along. If you even look at the first one, and then in Empire Strikes Back, and compare that to the throne room lightsaber duels that have happened in not only just Return of the Jedi, but some of the prequel films as well. All of that is about banter. It is nothing more than about banter and about tempting the player, tempting the pure white hat hero into doing something that is not in character. Pretty foolish. Yeah.
It's a social conflict. It's a social conflict to lure into an actual combat. It's a fight that the player can't win, or that the main character can't win, because Empire Strikes Back, Luke goes in there thinking he can win this fight against the Master, and he finds out that no, he cannot. He needs to go back and train some more.
Right. And if you try to run, and here's the thing too, you heard this like frustration. I've heard this frustration from players trying to emulate a Star Wars game going, well, my Darth Vader character shows up and I've got him completely statted up to like D12s and everything, all kinds of force powers. And the PCs just blast through him. Wild dice. Well, yeah, because that's not about combat. If you try to run that as a combat, you got a lot of dead wild cards and dead big bads, and it doesn't play right. Because you're trying to run that as a combat with lightsabers, and it's not about that. It's a duel.
Yeah.
I think there's another thing that I would throw out here in regards to this is, and I'm trying to make sure I have the thought fully formed, but the idea that this is for GMs the same way genre blindness is for players. It's something you have to buy into fully, to the idea that in this scene, a combat is not the best thing for your game. Just like in genre blindness, the players have to buy into, we're in a horror game, the best thing to do might be to call the cops, but for the game, the best thing to do is not to call the police, because that just brings about a non-dramatic end to a dramatic moment that should lead to the rest of the adventure. But you can kill the whole night in ETU by calling the police the first time you come across the dead body, and bam, you're over with. I mean, a bunch of guys broke in and took the waitress out of the fast food restaurant and ran off with her. Instead of hopping in your car and chasing after her, you call the police and give them the plate number, and that entire adventure just doesn't happen because you failed to have the genre blindness to buy in. From a GM perspective, this is the same thing. You've got to have that willingness to say, the best interest of the game is not to introduce a combat right now. The dragon is swooping by, picking up something and flying off of it. In that scene, it's great to run as a dramatic task or a social conflict or a mass combat, something else, because you don't want the dragon to take wounds and die from a lucky bow shot. You want the dragon to carry off the halfling that they then have to go save. You've got that moment where you need to introduce something to move the story forward. A combat can absolutely fuck your day up and bring the whole game to a screeching halt with one dice roll. And if it doesn't make sense, don't use it.
So that actually reminds me of a situation that happened. It was a game that I was in. I had a friend that was running a conversion of the Elder Scrolls game, and I was playing a wood elf archer. And I was walking through the cave, and I had my bow and I had a torch, and all of a sudden this like powerful necromancer comes out. And I'm having one of those OS moments, and the GM is like, what do you do? I say, I fire on him. He says, do you drop the torch? I say, no, I shoot him in the face with the torch. So he's thinking, okay, darkness penalties, improvised weapon, headshot, no possible way. I get like 3 explosions. And he just loses his mind. He's like, well, guys, nice campaign. That was the big bad.
Well, it's the same thing too. Like, I'm gonna bring a bazooka into a Cthulhu game. I'm gonna shoot Cthulhu in the face. No, you're not buying into the point of the game. You're not really getting it. It's the whole Indiana Jones scene too with the swordsman. That it's not a combat. That's not a duel. That's just set dressing. That's an entertaining, funny moment in the middle of a chase. I think we discussed it before too, like running agility tricks when combat, without taking combat literally by, I run up the wall, do a backflip, I slice the orc over the forehead or off his brow to get blood to bleed and temporarily blind him. Yeah, it's not about the orc taking wounds. It's about the orc being shaken and not being able to react. To the best mechanic for that is a simple agility trick.
Yep.
So before we get to Sunset Sam's question, I want to touch on something Art Fernandez said. He said, in a city environment, combat has repercussions with the local law and any civilians that might get hurt, etc. I don't disagree. I think that's a very key thing that you need to make sure you include in the game. But that doesn't enter into this consideration. This consideration is a different tool for when you as a GM know this moment, while combat is a mechanic that fits, it's not the most fun mechanic you could use to get through that scene effectively. It's about judging what's the most effective tool, not what tool leads to the characters having repercussions. You can have repercussions from a social conflict the same way you can from a combat mechanic. You know, if they win the social conflict and at some point during that one of the players narrated killing someone, well, then they have the ramifications of the role play they laid out. Their narrative was they killed somebody. You just killed somebody inside the city. You're still going to face the consequences of killing someone in the city limits, whatever that may be. So don't think of it in those terms. Again, this is a mental switch that's hard to flip, and it's the reason we're getting this question as often as we do in the community, is that people aren't thinking of it in a what's best for the narrative game going forward, rather than a, well, what's the rule book say to do when a player says they draw their sword, we deal initiative. But you don't have to. You can do these other things instead. You can even just run a simple give me a fighting roll. Okay, a success. It's not a attack. It's a give me a fighting roll. You rolled a success. Okay, you absolutely wreck that guy's stuff and move on. It's one dice roll, moving on. It's avoiding that drawn out full combat mechanic in a moment where it's just not necessary for an interesting story.
Right. Yep. Well, it's this too. You have to be, in order to do this too, you have to be very aware of what the genre is. What Dave was talking about earlier as a GM, and you have to have player buy-in. So in let's give a couple examples real quick. One of my favorite comedies, it is particularly for this scene, is Austin Powers. The scene where Scott comes out and Dr. Evil is like, okay, well, we're going to put them in this room. He's like, wait, I got a gun in the other room. I'll just shoot him in the... Shh, you don't get it, Scott. You don't get it. Well, no, I'm going to leave them in an easily escapable situation and assume everything went to plan, because it's not about killing Austin Powers. It's about the drama of him being, surrounded in a room with sharks with laser beams on their heads, and him escaping to have a meetup with the monologued villain over again. It's in a social conflict for a lightsaber duel, again, using the Star Trek or the Star Wars example. On when Luke loses that duel, he loses his hand.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not because Vader's trying to kill him. Vader's trying to put him in a weakened state and then appeal to him as, I'm your father. Join me. Well, don't make me kill you. I've already cut off your hand. Don't make me kill you. And he's trying to do that final thing to win that social conflict from that duel. Go ahead, Dave.
Yeah, the character's never actually under true mortal threat because the villain doesn't want to kill the player character at that moment. Mm-hmm. Your player is sitting there, role playing out Luke Skywalker, young Jedi Knight, and the villain has no desire for that character to die in this scene. Therefore, as a GM, it makes no sense to put yourself in a situation where one bad dice roll is a dead character, and now you're facing having to either retcon that, which we see a lot of with the fudging of the dice, and I don't let players die unless it's dramatically appropriate. Well, then why are you letting them get into combat unless it's dramatically appropriate? Combat is a mechanic that's there to put the player character at threat of death. If that shouldn't be on the table, neither should combat.
I think that's one of the issues, though, is it takes this whole, the whole saying that when to a hammer, everything in the world looks like a nail. And you got to get out of that mindset. The idea is that combat costs, and when you're playing with these characters, you sometimes get removed from that idea of the cost. So a GM has to think, even though a big bad is big and bad and can push people around, they still don't want to fight because the character would still feel pain in some capacity. It's got to be on the table, but you got to understand like this certain level of brinkmanship or strategy, or in all honesty, if the players are a good enough threat, try and recruit them. You'd be surprised how often as a sly GM, you can actually get the players working for you if you just jiggle some shiny keys in front of them.
So there's an interesting debate out there on the internet of never lie to your players. And to me, it's a misnomer. Never lie to your players. Always lie to their characters. The big bad should always be trying to subvert the player characters, should always be putting the damsel in distress that's a honeypot, should always be putting out, here's the distraction red herring mission where I'm going to send like 10 minions I don't care about over here to do this thing, while off in the distance I'm doing this other thing the players aren't allowed to see because of the sleight of hand of your GM, big bad. You should always have that level of disengagement going on so that you don't have to worry about suddenly a combat pops up with your big bad. And then when it does, don't deny the player access to drawing their sword and attacking the big bad. But if a combat's not the best way to handle the scene, don't use a combat. If you know you're going to use the zealot's setting rule, or you know you're not going to allow the big bad to die under, heroes never die, or whatever the case may be, if there's no threat on the table, don't put combat on the table as a resolution option. You can absolutely go a completely different direction with it.
Right. And you can telegraph that too, right? Oh, I'm going to have an audience with Jabba the Hutt. Yeah, you're turning over all your weapons before you stand in front of Jabba, because Jabba's no fool. He does not give audience to people who can kill him with a blaster 2 feet away. That's just not going to happen. Same thing like in Firefly, the Serenity movie. You see it where they had to check their guns at the door before they enter the club. Now, that doesn't mean that something drastic can happen and they all have to scurry to the door to try to find their weapons to defend themselves. But
or end up in a fist fight, because that can always break out. I think, again, this is more a mindset issue for the GM. And that's the reason we keep giving a lot of similes to other places, other popular culture that does this. We're trying to give you things that you can look at as examples to go, oh, this is where I, as a GM, am falling into the murder hobo trap and can sidestep it myself. And again, this is not a GM light tip. This is absolutely an advanced way of looking at the game as the GM tip that goes to, how do I take my game to the next level? Well, the way you do that is by being a next level GM that doesn't solve everything with the first rule in the book that would have handled it.
Now, I'm going to throw one out here. This is a very advanced tip, so bear with me. Stick in there. The iconic scene in Raiders of the Lost Ark where Indiana Jones has to face the giant German, and they're fighting in a very dramatic situation where the plane is moving and Indy's just getting the shit kicked out of him. Run that as a chase using fighting as the maneuverability, because the point is not to knock Indy out. He's not going to knock the German out. It's about having a very tense fist fight that he's not supposed to win in a very precarious situation and environment. And you could totally run that combat as a 5-round chase. And at the end of the chase, something happens to where either Indy's unconscious or the German is. And in that particular scene, the German got a complication, didn't make his agility roll, and the rudders went.
So Sunset Sam put in here, he's got 2 questions that kind of tie to each other, and I think this is a great time to address that.
All right.
He says he always thought that a GM should consider what failure really means before a dice roll is called. Do they really fall in the lava lake, or do they take a wound or fatigue? And then later on in the discussion, he reiterated and said, it also ties into a previous discussion. What a failure roll really means. Is it always abject failure? Is it always binary? And I think this is one of those things that goes into that telegraph part that Jared just said. And we've been big proponents of this on the show to, much negative feedback. Not only should the GM know, the player needs to know. The player needs to know the result of this dramatic task is if you fail, they get through the fence. You may not see combat, but they got through the fence. They broke the fence. The result of this dramatic task is you plummet out of the airplane without a parachute. The result of this, task is if you don't complete this dramatic task, you fail to get your hands on the poison after you were poisoned. As you're diving around on the dance floor with the ice and the diamonds and all of that, and the poison vial is sliding around. Now, Indy fails that dramatic task. It doesn't mean he dies. It means that another plot point later on resolves that another character in the scene. But Indy failed his dramatic task to regain the poison in that scene, the antidote to the poison. He's gonna die. He failed the dramatic task. He knew what the weight of that was when that dramatic task is laid out and still failed it.
And the irony of that particular scene, though, is if we're talking about Temple of Doom, he gets the antidote to the poison, but he closes the door and you see who owns the airplane.
Yeah, I mean, it's one of those cascading failures, but these are the things you have to telegraph to your player. Not only do you as a GM need to know them, and no, failure should not always lead to character death, wounds, fatigue. It should just lead to failure. Something interesting happens, but the player needs to know what's at risk. If you don't tell them what's at risk, they can't logically make a decision about their bennies. And we talked about this a couple weeks ago. Somebody asked, what's the easiest way to get rid of player bennies? Tell them what's at risk every time they make a dice roll. As soon as they know how bad failure might just be on that notice roll, on that stealth roll, on whatever it is, those bennies start dropping as they fear that more than they do just a blank roll failing.
Right. And it's happened to, I'll just share another dramatic task that made the character quite aware. Hey, look, well, I'm not sure if I made the character aware, but it fits in the game we were playing. I'm dragging a dead body back to a farm in a zombie apocalypse game. I'm weighted down. This is going to be a dramatic task with vigor. If you fail the complication, you're overrun by a herd of zombies. Period. That's what's it.
Character aware of.
I know I didn't. But it was based on the narrative that had happened previously within context. It made absolute sense. But
I'm not saying it was a bad move, but it's not the best example because you didn't telegraph.
So the player character gets a complication, barely overcomes it, gets another complication before the task is out, and fails it and has no more bennies. And he's like, oh, God, what happens? I went, yeah, that zombie you thought you hid from taps you on the shoulder, takes you down, and you're eaten alive by the other horde as they come in. And that was that wasn't a combat. That wasn't roll wounds against zombie bites. Nothing. That was, hey, this is the dark, dismal end. The worst possible thing that could happen happens. And you can just narrate that. And
to be fair, that setting actually has a setting rule that on a critical failure, the worst possible thing happens. It is a dark setting. So,
but that's apropos too. So there was the thing where you could have gone, oh, well, now we're going to end the dramatic task and break into a combat to see if you can survive. Nope. Narratively speaking, this is what needs to happen. You need to be overrun by zombies and eaten alive. Roll up a character.
I feel like that's the setting where you need to roll up like 2 or 3 characters at.
You have a couple of concepts. You should have a couple of concepts. I would say that.
I don't roll them up in advance, but I certainly have. I have concepts like bullets in the gun. Yeah. They're chambered and ready to go.
But this goes to we're talking. I know we're focusing really heavily on combat, right? But you can use social conflicts for bartering. if you have a situation where you don't have an actual currency economy in a fantasy role-playing game that you're running, and you want to have that, we're at the market, you can barter and run it as a social conflict.
The interesting thing with a lot of this is, again, it's that mental gymnastics of looking at this as a role-playing and then a game, rather than looking at it through the lens that we've been trained to look at it through since the 70s and 80s, when it was a tabletop war game that we're going to role play occasionally during. But this is also why there's a necessary shift that, yes, your players are expected to role play, and they're going to get bonuses based on that role play, but they also need to be making persuasion rolls. They need to be making taunt and intimidation rolls. When they have those social moments with an NPC, there needs to be some dice put to the table, and not just base it on how good an order the player is. Their character has an impact on that. The player might come up with a great role play and then roll a critical failure and fail to, they make a faux pas and mention, the king's dead daughter when they shouldn't have, or something of that nature, in that absolutely 86s that great idea and great role play into a negative reaction, because that's the game aspect, again, rearing its head. And as we start to take combat more and more off the table, we have to be willing to apply those social mechanics that already are in the rules. We have to be willing to apply those and keep a game still going on, but don't step on that role play. Don't quash the role play. Just have the game rules help modify that role, because, again, this is a cooperative thing. It's not just everything the players say doesn't happen. Everything you as a GM says doesn't happen. That's what the game rules are there to help adjudicate.
So one setting rule I think that's really helpful that never gets used. It's a Wiggy special. Paul Wade Williams.
Yep.
Yeah, that's a mouthful. And it's called Complications. So it's stated that at some point, a GM is going to have to take narrative control in order to push the story forward. So whenever you introduce a complication, go ahead and give all the players a Benny and tell them what happens. And I think that is a glorious rule that most GMs should consider absolutely adopting.
I think the initial version of that was in his Pulp toolkit, and it was capture. Surrender. And it was that idea that, the big bad shows up with a gun to the head of a hostage, and all the players have to throw down their weapons, and they automatically get a Benny, but then we move on to they've been captured by the big bad because they all chose to surrender. Most players don't think that's a dramatic scene. They want to draw their weapons and try to save the hostage. But really, if we look at kind of the pulp genre, the big moment in each one of those was that moment where the white hat surrenders to the black hat and then has to escape the death traps. It's a major plot point in nearly all of them that doesn't happen because your players are constantly drawing their weapons and attacking.
Right.
So it makes perfect sense. That's a great place to talk about something like that. And again, these are more advanced techniques. It takes a different mindset as a GM to utilize this stuff. And It's not going to happen overnight. It's not something, it took me 10 years of specifically working on this to change the way my brain thought about that in that moment. And it's absolutely a fake it till you make it kind of a thing. If you can force yourself to do it against your habits, you'll find that you build new habits and it becomes second nature.
So let's throw out a situation. I'm in a bar. I'm in a tavern. One of the player characters gets a little aggressive with one of the NPCs and pulls a sword. And the GM narrates, there's 100 town guard in here, and they all notch arrows on their bow. You're surrounded on all sides in this tavern with archers telling you to put your weapon down. And the player decides, no, I'm not going to put my weapon down, and Matt goes to make an attack against the guy that he's having the argument with.
Okay. No initiative cards. First way to handle this. Okay, great. That's absolutely perfect. Go ahead and give me a fighting roll.
Mm-hmm.
Well, what's my target? Just give me a fighting roll. Well, I want to use wild attack. No, this is not a maneuver. It's not combat. Give me a fighting roll. Oh, success. So you're able to draw the sword and you're bringing it down on the guy, and you actually score a minor wound. And then you feel black as your field of vision slowly constricts, and you realize that there's 6 or 8 darts sticking out of your back where they've hit you with a knockout drug. And you wake up 2 days later.
Yeah, in a prison cell, shackled to a wall.
Mm-hmm.
And now the adventure is the rest of the party has to get you out of prison.
Right. Now, is that now?
Here's actually done that in the game. So.
Oh yeah. So here's the question: is that violating player agency?
No.
I mean, if you give them the option to make horrible mistakes, I don't see how it's a violation of agency.
The player's agency was he attacks the person. I let him make the fighting roll, and I determined that it was off that one fighting roll. I determined not only that he hit, but he got a wound. I mean, I'm giving away exactly what the player asked for. The consequences, well, that's a completely different story, Jack, and that's all my ballywick. The player has no ability to call into question consequences. That's the GM's agency.
Yeah, so here's the thing, and I agree completely. But I can anticipate some pushback with that. Dude, that's a dick move. What do you mean? This should be settled by combat. Dude, I just specified there are 100 archers. Do you really expect me? Let's think about how this is going to work out. If we go to actual turn order and I make shooting rolls and we roll damage and we sit here for the next 10 minutes, your character's dead.
Yeah.
I'm doing you a favor by narrating an end to this conflict.
Not only that, I'm doing a favor to the rest of the party in case their player character felt obligated to jump into said suicidal combat that you just fucking started.
Right.
Yeah.
But, I mean, let's reverse that. Let's say it's not a suicidal thing, but it's trivial. You're in the bar, and the player character narrates they draw their knife and stab the thief who they just caught picking their pocket. It's no one's going to stop them. This is not a bar with the town guard in it. It's just it's a far out outskirts of the realm bar. There's 20 people other than the party in there. It's really easy to tell the thief got caught with his hand in the cloak of the player character. What do you do there? And I am putting this up, so I won't answer it.
Here's what I do in that situation. If they say I turn around and stab the thief's hand to the table and take my stuff back, yeah, you absolutely do. That's exactly what happens. Absolutely.
Give me a notice roll.
Or you may say, give me a notice roll versus stealth to know your hand's been pickpocketed.
No. I'm saying you've stabbed the dagger into his hand. Give me a notice roll. Yeah, the thief has this really weird tattoo on his wrist.
Yeah, you can roll it out a little bit further. But I'm just talking about the resolution of that. I don't even require a roll for that. It's not a combat. It's an interesting piece of the story. You're not killing the guy. Now, and here's the thing. And because I'm not putting the NPC in combat, guess what? He gets to exact his revenge at a later date. You stabbed me in the hand I used to pick pockets with. You've hobbled my career as a thief. I am going to hire bloodhounds to come after your ass and dance and piss on your grave. Now they got major enemy.
Yeah. I 30 sessions later, they're running into bandit after bandit after bandit who's wearing a glove with a little mark right in the back of the center of the hand. And every bandit's wearing the same glove on the same hand. Right. And then this goes on for another 10 or 20 sessions before they run into this guy who's been hunting them And these are all his fucking bandits. He's put together, a full thieves guild because he can't pick pockets anymore. All because a player narrated they stabbed the thief who picked their pocket.
Mm-hmm.
I want to throw another thing out there. What if the reason why you were able to catch him is because he sucks at a thief? And the reason why nobody's caught him before is he's related to somebody important. And now you don't have to deal with some spoiled rich kid who thinks he's a master thief. No, you have to deal with his father or his uncle who's the sheriff. Or maybe he's an illegitimate child of a local noble.
Yep. What about this idea? He actually wanted to get caught picking your pockets so he could join your band. And he becomes a trusted allied extra. It doesn't have to be a devious GM thing. Because
he becomes a trusted allied extra with the one-arm hindrance. Because you blamed him by sticking him to the table.
And then have that guy later save one of the main characters' lives as an allied extra, or as just an NPC extra. He intentionally got caught because he wanted to have a way to introduce himself and join your party. It doesn't have to be evil, mischievous, and vengeful. It can make for an interesting story, but it doesn't have to be. It can be a surprise to the players too. Like, wow, that guy we're gonna kill basically for robbing us. I'm really glad we didn't. He really turned out to be a useful guy. He actually saved my life. And then you have another big bad kill him for emotional gravitas. Like, oh no, not Sweet Concord. Oh, you bastards.
Yeah, the next time you don't allow combat to happen, it's somebody, just attacking and killing Concord automatically. But I think, again, these are things where we can't tell you the exact situation where this is going to be useful. Like, what's the word I'm looking for? What is the mechanic I'm looking for that we talk about all the time? Yes and, no but. Like those, this is another advanced tool to put in the toolbox and pull out when appropriate. But if you use it too often, you're going to rob your game of combat. And a lot of people play this game for the combat. I mean, let's not get it twisted. That's a major motivator to play. I'm going to conservatively say it's 85% of the rule book is combat. So I mean, don't overlook letting combat occur. It's just don't let combat be the only thing that occurs.
Right. It should be
too heavily.
It should be meaningful because it should be deadly. There should be a reason for you to get involved in combat, not just because it's a interesting little scuffle and story thing. Hand wave it, get through it as quickly as you can. It's part of the narrative. You don't need to drag it out, because anytime you put dice on the table as a GM, you've lost complete control of that story. The dice are now in charge.
Everyone at the table has lost control. The players have no control. The GM has no control. The dice are in control when the dice are called into play. And combat has the most dice rolls of anything you're going to do in your game. So introducing combat is introducing chaos.
Right. Well, and not only that, I just meant for this to be a little interesting bar fight. Oh, really? Then why did you make it combat? Because now this guy has brawny and he rolled a strength roll, and in one punch, his damage dice exploded 18,000 freaking times and literally decapitated your player character. He's dead because you thought it'd be interesting to run this bar brawl as a full-fledged combat. Understand that with Savage Worlds, combat is a deadly proposition.
I've said it every time in Media Res comes up that it is, in my book, it is a tactic I never use in Savage Worlds, because the players didn't choose to initiate that combat. I am throwing combat at them right out the gate before they even know what their characters are capable of to open a scene. That is not cool, because combat results in someone catching a case of the dead. It's the ultimate resolution of combat is someone is knocked out or killed. Mm-hmm. That's the best case scenario, is someone is knocked out or killed.
Could be your big bad. Oh, they killed my big bad. Well, why did you let it make it a combat and give them the opportunity?
Could be the player characters. Oh, I don't like players to die when it's not dramatically appropriate. Then why did you introduce combat when it wasn't dramatically appropriate?
Some things you just don't do.
Well, and if you do those things and you learn from those mistakes, kind of go, maybe I shouldn't have.
Well, and I think we've taken the lumps over the years because we're the podcast that says don't fudge the dice. When death occurs, use all the rules and make them roll against incapacitation. And if they die, they die. Doesn't matter if it's dramatically appropriate. Sometimes stupid shit happens. Meteor flies through the roof that fell from space, and you just happen to catch one in the head, and you're dead. Doesn't matter what point of life you were at. Those things happen when you put dice on the table and allow combat to enter your game. Be aware of it. Don't be afraid of it. Don't shy away from it. But also, don't use combat if you don't want to put player characters and NPCs at risk.
Well, let's say I'm playing a pulp adventure, and I want my heroes to plow through fisticuffs, a bunch of mooks, just a fucking ocean of mooks. So I need to give all the mooks. I can't let their wild die. I can't let their fighting die explode. Let's see. I need a whole bunch of other setting rules to make sure that combat turns out the way I want it to. No. How about you just make one fighting roll, and on a success, they just wade through. On a failure, they still wade through, but now they have a level of fatigue. That's it. I mean, that's all you need to do, and just narrate.
That goes back to the beginning of the conversation where I said you can always, if you need that level of fatigue, if you need that wound, if you need that risk, you can run the quick combat rules, which give you that bite for a quick, 1 or 2 dice rolls. Now, Art Fernandez brought up an interesting situation that I think plays into this directly. He says in his current game, his players are working for goblins to clear out a goblin cave because they caught the goblins trying to steal armor so that the goblins could go off and do it themselves. Had they just gone all murder hobo and slaughtered the goblins, they'd have missed out on the adventure. Now, I was recently listening to the Wild Die podcast, and Gary goes on this big rant about how it's his goddamn story when he comes to the table, and no, you're not going to go to the next town over because his story happens in this town, and this is where you're going to fucking be. And I mean, he goes on a rant about how all other podcasts are wrong. First of all, Gary, no, you're wrong because you're robbing the game from your players. But in this moment, if Art's entire story revolves around the players being hired by these goblins, and he introduces combat, there's a really good chance they're going to kill his goblins. So to introduce the rest of his plot, he needs the goblins alive. Great time to roll a social conflict or a dramatic task to stop the thievery without killing the goblins.
And I've heard that podcast episode that you're referring to as well. And that springs from Gary talking about the Quantum Ogre. I've prepped the session tonight for this. I have this. I have that. And I'm not comfortable with you deciding to turn left at Albuquerque because I don't have Albuquerque planned out. So, no, you're on the rails. You bought a ticket. Shut the hell up. Choo, choo, choo.
And the interesting aspect that I will say to that is there's nothing wrong with having an adventure loaded in the pipe ready to go. But you also have to be capable of thinking on your feet for when that shit does go off the rails. Because again, you're not playing a video game. You're not playing a choose your own adventure novel where the list of options is right there and the players have to pick from them. Instead, you're playing a role-playing game and you have to mold that shit to what your players are doing. And the players have to have a certain level of buy-in so that they don't put you in that situation all the time as well. I mean, let's be fair. It's a two-sided coin. GMs have to be flexible, but the players have to occasionally recognize the fact that they've been hooked on a plot hook and it's time to just follow the line in and be reeled in by the story.
Right. Well, also, too, a lot of that could be you've introduced an interesting place. You've mentioned it as part of your role play. You've enticed those player characters to want to go visit this thing that you've presented.
Yeah, if you don't ever mention that there's something to the left of Albuquerque, your players don't know they can go left at Albuquerque.
And they tend not to. Players will tend to follow the plot lines and rails that you lay out in front of them. So be careful when you're narrating if you're not prepared to go ahead and have them visit the Rusty Dragon Inn because you thought it was a clever name to throw out there, and then they go, "Ooh, that sounds interesting. Let's go visit the Rusty Dragon Inn." Oh, I don't have anything prepped, you bastards. There's nothing for you gotta watch it. And even if let's talk about this for a second. We're not playing Dungeons and Dragons or Cult Finder.
Right.
I don't need to have detailed battle maps of the Rusty Dragon Inn or a town. I don't need it. I've got Savage Worlds. I can off the top of my head. Oh, the extras have 1 wound and a D6 and whatever I want them to roll.
But why
do I need time to go off and go up, and then go prep that?
How am I going to order a drink if I don't know the bartender's combat rating?
Yeah, this is Savage
again, I didn't bring this up just to bash on Gary's.
No, not at all.
Oh, we love Gary.
I mean,
platonically speaking.
I've had conversations with Gary pretty extensively where the big thing that he relied on for a lot of years was pre-written in modules and stuff, and those just don't exist much for Savage Worlds. I mean, let's be fair. Savage Tales are out there for some of the plot points in the second half of the book. There's some one sheets, but there's just not a lot of pre-written modules and adventure paths for Savage Worlds, mostly because the GMs of Savage Worlds don't want them. So there's no reason for the licensees and PEG to release them. Is people to start buying and running those things.
Right. And when you look at the Savage Tales too, look at the one sheets and the Savage Tales, they're very open, sandboxy, freeformed as well. Yeah. They don't say, well, characters have 3 choices. If they choose A, B, or C, this is what happens. It just sort of sets a stage and says, all right, let it play out, see what happens. Nice lull of the conversation.
Well, awesome. I don't want to overbeat the examples and similes and metaphors, because I think we've done that quite a bit. I will say the thing you're going to find happens in your game when you do this is your players become more resilient to not having to think of mechanics and relying more on narrative. The players will narrate some batshit crazy thing that they want their character to do and not worry about, well, is that a wild attack or a trick? Is it a multi-action? They won't think in those terms if you train them that they can declare an action and all of a sudden it launches a social conflict, or all of a sudden it launches a dramatic task, or all of a sudden it launches a chase scene, because you've trained them that just because they're doing something cool, it doesn't mean it's a combat maneuver. You've trained them to be more descriptive, more narrative with what they want their characters to do. And you're going to find that your game improves and everything is, a rising tide floats all boats. So being better at this will make your combats even better, because now your combats aren't just the third combat of the night. It's now, well, here's the combat of the night. And it's a lot more bombastic. It's a lot more important because it's important enough to be a combat.
Right. We have anything else in the chat we want to talk about? Anything else we want to share? I think we've pretty much exhausted this topic.
Yeah.
I can't think of much else that we would need to talk about. Go ahead. Savage Zealot.
I was going to say that some of the people are mentioning the Palladium system and how it makes use of the D100 system. I don't know how anybody feels about that, but you could potentially break out other systems and maybe try doing one of those roles if you wanted to. Or even check out the adventure generator. You don't have to go through a full outline with the adventure generator. Right.
Okay, so I'm going to take this lull in the conversation to load up a small rant. And again, this is triggered by conversations I've been seeing lately and whatnot. There is a vast plethora of information on the internet that doesn't come from a rule book, that talks about how to simulate other systems in Savage Worlds. The benefits of, Index Card RPG or Fate or Genesis, or this other system handles this better than Savage Worlds, and this is the house rule you can use to achieve that. I think that as podcasters and pundits online, we have to accept the fact we have a responsibility to stop downplaying how good Savage Worlds does those things.
Yep.
Those other systems, yeah, they're great. And, I've talked about 7th Sea's new mechanic for, you have this thing you achieve that unlocks an advancement for the character that's not an XP reward. And we've talked about, the dice pools from other games that are more interesting when it comes to things like taunt and intimidate, because you can taunt them based on a weakness they have and add to your dice pool, or you can intimidate and be a big burly guy, and Brawny ends up buying you extra dice. Those are great. And for those systems, it makes perfect sense. But Savage Worlds has some great rules too. You don't need to emulate these other systems to achieve those same great moments in Savage Worlds. But what you have to do is you have to look at what rules are going to be fun for your players. And here again, this is why I'm tying it into this conversation, is sometimes a dramatic task just makes more sense than a combat. Or sometimes a combat makes more sense than a chase. You might need to run vehicular combat, even if you're Sunset Sam and hate those rules, because, that's what the scene calls for. A chase or a dramatic task really doesn't handle it. So be aware that when you're giving out advice to people, when you're creating these house rules, stop trying to emulate what was fun in another system and look at what's actually fun in Savage Worlds. And sure, I'm not saying don't borrow from other games, and I'm not saying don't have fun, don't make house rules, but make house rules that make sense for Savage Worlds, not house rules that make sense because you played this other game and it was cool. Stop trying to fix the deficiencies you're seeing in Savage Worlds with other games and start trying to find out, maybe you're doing it wrong. Maybe there's a rule there that you've not used and aren't aware of. Maybe you're not running surprises or ambushes or social conflicts completely right according to the rules, and that's why you felt that need to patch it. You can fix a lot of things by going back and rereading that section of the book, playing in somebody else's Savage Worlds game and seeing what they do in that scenario. There's a lot more things you can do as a GM that don't require you to go, this part of the rules is not what I want, and hack it out.
But Dave, I want lightsaber duels in my Star Trek setting.
Chainsaw.
They're both sci-fi. Star Trek is missing the Jedi and lightsabers, damn it.
Oh, gosh.
I hear you. I hear you, though.
I'm not going to cut you. I'm going to strangle you. A lightsaber garrote.
But, it's... I think a lot of it is that Savage Worlds, with the rules system it has, it demands a lot from the players and a lot from the GM, a lot more so than most other role-playing game systems I've seen. It doesn't spoon feed you every little detail. It says, hey, here's a framework, go. What the details are, that's up to you. If you just want to go, hey, look, where are the rules for picking somebody up and throwing them? Well, look at what's there and what the outcome is. What is the intended outcome of that action? It's to move them a certain number of inches in another direction. Is there a rule? Is there a rule that already does that? Yeah, it's called push. So just describe push as you pick him up and body slam him 6 feet away. Done. The mechanic doesn't care. And the other thing, too, is Savage Worlds doesn't go and go, hey, you have to use this rule to do that. And this is the only option. It says, hey, here's a few interesting options. Choose the one that fits. Make the best choice, because it's a generic role-playing game system. It's not supposed to, it's like, well, Where are the rules and the core rules for samurai? That's a generic core rules. If you want like an adaptation of that, go look at somebody who's written a setting about samurai and how they use the existing rules to do that.
You can either use trappings over top of, say, Code of Honor to replicate a samurai in your game, or you can create a setting rule that captures that feel, like we see with, the what is that rule in Deadlands Noir that captures the whole "you've been hit in the back of the head with the butt of a pistol"? The
knockout.
Yeah. So there's a rule that they created, doesn't need to exist in Savage Worlds. There's no requirement anywhere in Savage Worlds for a knockout blow, but they set it up because it makes sense in that pulp noir thing where the guy just comes around the corner, hits you across the back of the head, blackjacks you, and takes you off to the next scene, because that's what happens in those stories. Could you have done that with something else? Oh, absolutely. It's a attack with the drop to the head that gains bonuses because the character's unaware and from the assassin edge, but it deals unarmed damage, so it just knocks the player out. You could do it. You can trap it and throw all the trapping paint necessary to make it work, but there's room to make the setting rule as well. But you didn't need to go, well, what does this other game, Gumshoe, do when someone gets knocked out? Well, they've got this other mechanic. No, you don't need to shoehorn Gumshoe into Savage Worlds to handle that. You can make a Savage Worlds rule that makes sense.
Right. And the interesting thing, too, about knockout, I'll say this, too, is when they created that rule, they understood very clearly what the intent of that was. Listen, we need a kind of small little rule mechanic in here for when somebody gets pistol whipped against the back of the head, because it's supposed to knock them unconscious. That's the intent. So it's a simple, you make a fighting roll against the target. They make a vigor roll against the damage. If they don't overcome the vigor roll, they're unconscious. They don't have wounds. They're just unconscious.
I believe that they added that to Deadlands Noir.
Yeah, that's what we're talking about.
I know. What I'm saying is I believe the reason they added that to Deadlands Noir is because of the nature of the genre. The Gumshoe gets knocked out. He wakes up. The place is tossed. The cops are asking him questions. Right. Like, it has certain hindrances like Rebel or,
what's the one where you're like Paramour or something like that, where you're
Lech.
Lech. You've got a weakness for the opposite.
Yeah.
I mean, it has things that reinforce that genre, and that's what you should be including.
Right.
But they're not forcing something in from another rule book or making it overly complicated. Even what they're doing with Knockout, for example, is very elegant and very, very much Savage Worlds kind of mechanic. It's very fast. It's very simple. It's not complicated or overly complex. It's what's the end goal? Knockout. Okay, so how do we go from point A to Z the fastest and shortest direction? Well, vigor roll against the strength damage, or you're unconscious.
I know there's that whole Fast, Furious, Fun thing out there. Be aware, fast doesn't always mean that it's the fastest way you can get to resolution. Yeah. In many cases, fast might mean what's the easiest way to be able to prep for what's going to still take 3 hours for the player characters to reach a resolution, so that you didn't have to spend 9 hours of prep to set that up for them. That's also part of that fast. It's not always about, can you cut this down to where you're trimming all the fat off and there's nothing there. No, you can leave a lot in your game that slows it down because it makes sense for the game. It's going to be more fun if this is a little meatier, it takes a little bit longer. But it was still easy to prep, or it's easy to understand. That's where the fast part can really key in. As a GM, learning how to appropriately apply fast, furious, and fun to your game makes Savage Worlds a lot more usable than being very literal with it. That I have to take the quickest combat resolution option. I have to take the most furious combat resolution option. I have to find the most fun. Fun is so nebulous. Have a good time trying to determine the most fun.
Well, I'm going to say this too, real quick. Jeff Jones mentioned when we're talking about throwing somebody, strength roll to pick them up, throwing roll to throw them through the window. Sure, that works too. Absolutely do that. 1 round to pick them up, 1 round to throw them. Sure, absolutely do that. I prefer the push method because even though it's labeled push, the outcome is that person is now 1 inch or 2 inches on the tabletop away. And for me, the fastest, simplest way to do it.
With a raise, they're also prone, which makes perfect sense for a throw.
Right. That's why I use the push mechanic for throwing some. Like Dave in one of our games picked up Wolf by the tail and did the slingshot, hammer pop, let him go. It's a throwing roll. It's the push roll. The outcome is to get the wolf away quickly. It's all trapping. It's just trapping about how he goes about doing it. But enough of that. I think we've sufficiently turned this equine into glue. So until next time, this is your host, Jared Savage Daddy Gunning, for Dave, the Rules Baby Scott, and Dustin, the Savage Zealot, saying keep rolling, stay savage.